So, just a little bit about me before we chat through the game. I've worked in games for about 10 years now. I've worked in all manner of different genres, starting with driving games on the Driver franchise, on the Crew, and then a loot shooter, so that was The Division, third-person action open world. Then a couple of iterations of the FIFA games, working on those. And then for the past, 2.5, 3 years, I've been working on Hood, Outlaws and Legends. So about the game. It's a competitive multiplayer heist game, so the idea is that you're breaking into a castle. The idea is that you're stealing a treasure chest from that castle as part of a team, so that's your team on the right hand side, potentially 4 different characters. It's a player versus environment kind of game, so you've got guards that are preventing the treasure from being stolen, but on top of that there is also a second team that's got the same objective as you, so you're not only fighting against the guards, but you're also preventing the other team from winning too. And then there's tactical, stealth and action elements. So this tactical side is dependent on your team makeup. So in this image, you've got an even spread, but you can have people that are mostly ranger based, mostly melee based, and that affects the outgoings of the match. The stealth aspect is about sneaking into the castle. So basically, going in unaware, undetected, and preventing the enemy team from seeing you. But if all goes wrong, or especially in the final third when it's the daring kind of escape, that's when the action kind of kicks in. So it's all melee combat and ranged combat kind of focused. And the 4 characters themselves, they're class based. So the 2 characters in the middle are ranged characters, so that's Marion and Robin, and on the left hand side you've got Tuck, and on the right hand side you have John, so there's your melee characters. So yeah, 2 different play styles, but then they each have their own flavours on top of that. And the game itself was made by about 50 developers, as I say, over the last 2.5 years, and this was made in Unreal Engine 4. So just in terms of the main man himself, so we're looking at Robin Hood predominantly, and when it comes to his bow and arrow, or when it comes to pretty much any mechanic in any game, these are 3 factors that you can take into account that would help deliver you a satisfying experience, or deliver a high quality kind of feature, and they fit into these categories. So you got authenticity, accessibility and aesthetics, and I'm going to go through each of these in turn, as to how they fit and how you can make it a memorable experience for people. So let's start with the first one. So authenticity is all about where you take your inspiration from. So when you talk about a bow and arrow in a game such as Hood, there is plenty of reference that's out there. You've got the films that are on the top row, you've got Legolas, Hawkeye, you've got Katniss, and then on the bottom row you've got all the characters from Horizon, Tomb Raider and Last of Us. These are pretty prominent examples, and these are the types of expectations that players will have for the quality and the feel of a particular bow, and the types of actions that you would expect to be able to do with these things. And then in terms of our game itself, so the game is set in a Game of Thrones style universe. So this isn't Robin Hood, kind of Men in Tights. It's very gritty, it's very grounded. And part of that is to do with the combat, especially, is that the combat is violent and visceral. So it's very harsh. There's lots of blood that splats out. There's things like every impact that you make, you feel it with the hit reactions. And that leads into your meaningful impact. So you can die in this game in a couple of hits. A one-shot headshot will also kill you in some instances. Takedowns will kill you instantly. The idea is that this is a game where every impact you will know about it. It doesn't take 10 hits to kill somebody. You can die in a couple of hits. And the other side of that is that it's about limited resources. So we're not giving you infinite ammo. We're not, replenishing you 100% of the time. You have to make do with what you've got. But also the stuff that you've got in your inventory is going to be very powerful. So you're going to be able to kill people pretty easily. Now that we've looked at the different types of inspirations for different types of games and different types of films that have had bow and arrows, but also the experience and the tone, there's 2 examples here that I want to run through that helped inform the bow and arrow kind of gameplay. One is from Battlefield on the left hand side. If you take a look at this clip, there's a tracer dart gun. The tracer dart is a projectile that fires and hits a target over distance, and actually people feel pretty satisfied when they hit a target from a long way because it's got fall off and gravity kind of drop off.
I got eyes on infantry, over. Oh, what a beauty!
Yeah, so as you can see, that guy's pretty satisfied with the fact that he's hit a target in the distance with a pistol. It's a single shot pistol, and bear in mind that pistol does no damage whatsoever, so it's quite a satisfying feeling to land the shot from that far away. And then the other side of it, this is from an advert from the 90s, the Strongbow adverts, and the idea is that at the end of the advert, every time it finishes, there are 2 arrows that fire into a bar or a nearby wall or a painting or something like that. And it's about the sound effect, the feeling of how powerful this sounds.
Oh, dear.
So those 2 arrows at the end, they don't sound like twigs, they don't sound like pieces of wood flying through the wind. They sound like giant hammers tearing through the air, and they land with a sledgehammer kind of impact. So the feeling for the bow is what if we went something like this, which was something where you've got to drop off over distance, and it feels quite satisfying to hit, but also that combined with the power and the velocity, the feeling of power from the right hand side, the Strongbow advert. So, in terms of Robin's playstyle then, so when you chat about the playstyle, he's effectively the master kind of archer, in terms of the core fantasy. The master archer is effectively proficient with the bow. He's never going to miss kind of intentionally. He's always going to feel like he's the master of the bow. He has an affinity for that particular object, so you need to feel like you are the expert when you use that thing. And like I say, when he never misses, if he does miss, it's normally because he wants to miss, or he wants to wound the target, or he wants to give them a warning shot. So we don't necessarily want to introduce any RNG, any randomization to player shots. It needs to be kind of pinpoint accurate. And ammo efficiency as well. So this ties into what we mentioned earlier. Robin Hood doesn't need 10 arrows to kill somebody. He just needs 1. So every arrow that he has, he makes the most of it. And that's something that we kind of took from that as well. So in terms of his role, so I mentioned earlier that there is 4 different characters in the game. There's 2 ranged characters. Robin, who is our sniper archetype. We're effectively trying to keep you at long range as much as possible. So when we chat about the sniper archetype, what we mean is we want him to be lethal and accurate from long range. We don't want you getting into a melee fight. We don't want you to kind of quick scope people up close. What we want you to do is get the super satisfying, Hail Mary shot from the other side of the map. And yeah, he's kind of getting tuned that way. And then in terms of the skill, so the real skill or the challenge of playing this particular character is that you're anticipating the kill. That when the arrow lands, that target is going to die, which is cool. But the challenge is being able to spot the target in the first place, getting into a position where you have overwatch over the map. So basically, you get some more situational awareness. Being able to lead the target, so knowing where the target is going, whether that's running, sprinting, crouching, being able to predict, the path that they're taking, and then fire where they're going. And then the other one is the gravity compensation. So not only do you have to lead the target, but also you want to slightly aim above the target as well, because over range it's going to drop off. If you're aiming at the head over distance, the chances are you might hit the chest by the time the arrow gets there. When it comes to setting up a weapon like this, ultimately you're asking 2 questions first. The first one is, where is the origin of the damage source? And the second one is, what is the intended travel time to the target? And the reason you ask these 2 questions is because they give you a grid, and the grid informs the kind of the direction, for what similar games or games of this ilk tend to go for, specifically in the third-person genre. So the first one, where is the origin of the damage source? You've got these 2 choices. Generally speaking, you're going for either the center of the camera, so this is the player's viewpoint, and looking at the center of the screen, normally where the reticule point is, or you're coming from the weapon itself. So whether that be a bow and arrow, a weapon such as a gun, a rocket launcher, wherever it may be, whether it's coming from the weapon itself. The reason why this differs in a third-person game is because the camera and the weapon is not always in the same place, as opposed to, say, a first-person game where they are. And the second question is, what is the intended travel time to the target? Well, you end up with a situation like this where it's hit scan, which is more like a bullet. So, when something's in the center of your screen and you click the button, you push the kill button, that thing just dies instantly. Or you've got a projectile, which is the arrow on the right hand side, which is it has some inherent travel time, so it needs to get to its target first, so it's not as immediate as say hit scan. So in the top left, you've got the camera, and you're shooting bullets. So this is shooting from the center of the screen, and generally speaking, you're shooting something immediate or near immediate. So this is something like PUBG, where you're firing down the center of the screen, you're firing bullets. They're pretty fast. Some of them have some kind of fall off, but generally speaking, when it's in the center of your screen, it just dies. So the things you got to account for this kind of camera view or this kind of style is that you got to compensate for peaking. So in this instance, there is a red dot at the end of the weapon. That weapon prevents it from shooting if the target is blocked. So effectively, it stops you from shooting around corners. And then the other thing is that it compromises the creative intent. So when you're chatting about a bow and arrow kind of game, if you're using bullets, then it's not going to feel like a bow and arrow, because an arrow has an inherent kind of travel time to get to its target. So similar example, so you're still firing a bullet this time, except instead of firing it from the center of the screen, you're firing it from the weapon. This is something like Resident Evil or Dead Space, where you've got to look at where the trail, or generally it's normally like a 3D trail or a 3D projection, that tells you where the bullet's going to go. The problem with this one is that you got to compensate for the environment. If that laser hits a box, the bullet will hit the box. If the laser hits a wall, it will hit the wall. So you got to compensate for having an environment where it doesn't block the players shooting too much. The next example, compensating for the environment again. So if you take a look at, The Last of Us, this is The Last of Us 1, you do get that same trail towards the right-hand side of the picture. So again, they're firing it from the weapon. They're not firing it from the center of the screen. The weapon represents, and the trail represents where the projectile is going to go. The difference between this and Resident Evil is that it is a projectile. There is some travel time between where the object spawns and the target it's going to hit, so it travels there over a time period. And then the last one is, The Last of Us 2. So you might notice, anybody that's played Last of Us 2, is that they actually changed their behaviour quite significantly. They went from, shooting a projectile, which they still have, but they went to shooting it from the camera instead. And you'll have a reticle point in the centre of the screen that tells you where, the shot's going to go. But generally speaking, now you're not shooting it from the weapon anymore, so you can get offset. So the problem with the projectile is, though, in general, is that it compromises the barrier to entry. It makes it more difficult for people to play the game, mostly because it's got some travel time. You have to account for where the target's moving, where it's, leading to. Whereas with a bullet, for example, you can just click the button and it will die. So it can make it more difficult if you use projectiles. So, which of these did we kind of choose for HUD? So, generally speaking, the top left, you've got a contemporary shooter. So again, we're a bow and arrow game, so probably not that. You got more precision shooting, so that's Dead Space, Resident Evil, where you're trying to shoot a very specific body part, or you're trying to aim with very fine precision. You got precision archery, so The Last of Us does have multiplayer mode within it, but it actually is pretty difficult for that reason. You're having to lead targets with a projectile that moves through the air, but also you can clip it onto the environment. So we actually went with more contemporary archery, which is you're shooting a projectile from the center of the screen. This is how Horizon does it. This is how Tomb Raider does it. But the projectile itself has some travel time, so it makes it feel like a projectile, and there's some visual tricks you can use to make it feel that way as well. I'll go through some of those. So just a quick summary on those. So basically, you've got reality versus expectation. So people have influences, they have appreciation for things that they've come across before, whether it be the Arrow TV series or it be the Infinity War kind of films. People have an expectation of how a bow and arrow should feel and how it should behave. The market awareness. So again, when you're looking at the high quality kind of examples, what's the type of things that they do? What's the type of things that you do? How does it work in terms of where their projectiles spawn and so on? So it's that kind of stuff as well. And the other side of it is, the creative intent. So we said earlier we want to have a tone where it's quite visceral, where, you don't get much ammo, where we want to make it feel like it's a bow and arrow. So you need to be able to do these things as well. And the grid that I've just shown you feeds into the next section, because you got to know this stuff ahead of time to account for accessibility. So accessibility is about, how do you make it enjoyable for as many people as possible? It's great to have a bow and arrow that feels good, but if you're the only person that can use it successfully, then that's a problem. So you need to make it as broad as possible, to as wide an audience as possible. So just in this example here, this is the very first thing that we did was we took the bow and arrow mechanics, in Hood, and we do something very similar to what most of the, shooting games do. You've got aiming on the left, you've got charging on the right. So charging is you're getting ready to fire the bow. They have slightly different camera transitions. There is slightly different sway on the screen as well. You'll notice on the right-hand side that the camera barely moves from the point that you're kind of looking at, and that goes back to that we want to keep you in the charge mode as much as possible. We zoom in much more during the charge mode than we do in aim. Next one as well, so you got quick fire. So again, the left hand side, you get minimum power, so basically it's low damage, it's got minimum amount of recoil. However, if you charge it to the maximum, it's a much more powerful shot. It gets to its target much quicker, but also you get the kick up, it makes it feel a little bit more powerful as well. And these two mechanics, the reason why I mention these is this is very similar to what other games do, so people are already familiar with this behavior. We're going to start here as a basis. And then the next one, slightly darker images, but on the left-hand side, you've got the fall off of projectiles. You can see it kind of dipping much more harshly than on the right-hand side. And the difference on the right-hand side is that the shot is much more powerful. The quick fire is more like a cat scratch, whereas the charge fire is much more like a cannonball has just hit you. And then ranged assists. So again, going back to what I said earlier, is if you're trying to hit a target from range, how do we get you onto the target quicker? How do we help your projectile to get onto the target? Or, how do we prevent you from missing as much as possible? We're trying to help you make the most of the low ammo count that you've got. So in this first image, we do have a snap to target. Again, this can be disabled on PC, but on gamepads, as long as you're within a close enough range to the target, we will snap onto them. We also snap onto their neck as well, which means that you don't get a free headshot because there's some travel time and some drop off with the projectiles. But also it means that we help you 90% of the way. The player's got to do the additional 10% of movement if they want to get the headshot. So we don't give you a free headshot, but we do allow you to get onto the target. And then on the right hand side is we've got homing projectiles. So if you watch the shots, you'll see they'll slightly dip towards the target. They don't fire in a straight line. They curve towards a target that's close to your viewpoint. So we're always trying to help you, as much as we can. And that's especially useful if it's a moving target. Okay, so when we go back to that example I mentioned earlier is, being able to compensate for peeking. Here's an interesting example, more from a competitive multiplayer perspective, which is, you're lining up the target in your sights down the center of the screen. That's where the projectiles come in from. However, the bow itself, if you look in the foreground, the bow's been blocked by a couple of boxes. And in this kind of scenario, it's not a bad thing in a single player game or against the AI. But when it comes to a competitive scenario, what it means is that you can kill somebody from round a corner and they couldn't see you. There's nothing that they could do about it. So other games tend to do it, similar to this, which is you do a bunch of ray traces, you have it so that so long as the ray traces don't collide with a particular object, let's say it's a wall or a barrier or something like that, then you can still shoot the target. The moment that those start intersecting with objects, then we prevent you from shooting. So effectively, we're trying to always make it so that the character is visible if you can shoot the target. If you can shoot the target and you're invisible, then it feels pretty cheap. You might also notice in the top right as well, we chamfer all of the edges of our kind of balustrades, so it makes it much more comfortable for shooting around them as well. So that's a nice little trick. And yeah, if you go back to that image again, so imagine that those invisible traces are now blocking, intersecting with those boxes, so they're blocking the sight. And what we do instead is we draw an indicator on the screen. That indicator tells the player that if they fire now, you're going to hit the boxes instead. And that's a pretty standard approach used in Metal Gear Solid's, Fortnite, PUBG and things like that, to prevent abuse, basically. So obstacle blockers, so the same thing can get used again, but to the player's benefit. As long as you don't get too close to something, you can still shoot through it. So here's the balustrades. So as long as you don't intersect too much, it's pretty comfortable to shoot in all angles. However, if it is a problem, you'll get that red indicator that will come up, and it'll stop you from shooting. And the same for exposed barriers. So you can look through, pretty comfortable at all ranges. If you do get too close or you start intersecting, the red dot will come up, but in this case it's pretty generous. And yeah, you can shoot through those gaps as well. And yeah, so corner shooting. So again, here's a more descriptive version of, player versus player. If you keep a watch on the right hand side image, just where my mouse cursor is, you'll see the character will pop out. But as you look at the left hand side, you'll see the points where the player can get shot and where they can't get shot. There's a red aiming blocker on the left, so you can't shoot the target, even though he's lined up his headshot. But yeah, he has to move out into the open so he can be seen on the right. If you move back far enough, we also allow you to shoot as well. Again, on the right hand side, you can barely see the target whatsoever. And if you do get too close to something, we force you to put your bow down as well. So now I can see the target, but I've still got a red aiming blocker. And as soon as he moves out into the open, then you can get the headshot. Okay, so a slightly different example this time. So in a game where you can die in a couple of hits, we want to inform the player where the danger is coming from. So we have several different ways of doing that in this video. You'll see if you watch near this tree, you'll see a glint from the archer giving away his position. You'll see projectile trails that fly through the air. And you'll also hear, maybe not in this video, but we have 3D audio, so it represents the directionality that the projectile is coming from. There's the glint. There's the trails, representing which direction. And we have an indicator in the top left that tells you where you got hit. There's another trail. And that one's come from behind. So that trail persists for slightly longer for Robin's ability arrow. So his ability arrow is an explosive arrow. When somebody fires that, they effectively give away their position. So other signifiers, so as you've seen 3 things go through the air, we do have projectile caps, so pretty straightforward. The arrow is difficult to see, but a projectile cap is effectively a VFX that's placed over the top of it, and it makes it much clearer to see, especially in dark environments. And from a range, you can see not only where it's coming from, but what direction it's kind of heading in. Without that VFX, you just can't see this whatsoever. You'll see it fly through the scene now. And it leaves a trail just in its path. And the other one is that every time you miss, if you look in the distance, you'll see a flash. That flash represents where the arrow actually landed, and it basically gives you a hint as to what you need to do for your next shot here. If you miss the first shot, we're trying to help you not miss the second. Another slightly different example of accessibility is we're providing some tolerance for indicators. So there is indicators in the game, much like this one here, where it's telling you where the objective is. The problem is, from a range character perspective, is when you begin to aim, that indicator actually gets in your way. So what we did for this is we start to blend things out. We fade it from existence. Every time you aim, it just fades off pretty quick. You can still see the targets, you can tag them. But every time you aim, it prevents that. We did have a situation in development where you were aiming at targets, the icon would get in your way and would actually prevent you from getting headshots, so we just remove it completely. So yeah, bushes is another example. So we have stealth bushes in the game. You can hide within these, you can stay hidden, much is signified by the outline that's on the character. But the bushes are so dense that, again, when you're aiming from them, it's not very comfortable. So one of the things we did here is that we actually fade out the bush when you're aiming. So you'll see that in this example here. So a slightly different example. You've got frantic sprinting and predictable sprinting. So for quite a while in development, you're able to do what's happening on the left hand side is the playable characters could sprint aside, to each side extremely fast, making it very, very difficult not only to be able to even shoot the target, but be able to keep your sights over them entirely. So the way we got around this is, if you look at the right hand side, we made it so that there is a longer kind of turn time between stuff. You can still change directions, you just can't do it as quickly, so your angle of kind of rotation has been reduced quite significantly. It makes it much easier to keep the target within your center of view, whereas on the left hand side you're having to overcompensate quite a lot more. So in terms of hitboxes, so there's two different things that we have going on here. So the left hand side is the default kind of hitboxes that we have in the game. Think of it like the Michelin Man. They have giant kind of spheres or giant capsules all around different parts of their body. The capsules relate to different bones, and the bones represent the types of damage that you're going to do to the character. So we have the head and we have the neck, which counts as a headshot. Everything else below that counts as a body shot. So it doesn't matter if you hit somebody in the hand or you hit somebody in the leg or the torso, it still does the same damage. But on the right hand side, just in terms of big head mode, it's much more tolerant in the sense that the head and the neck both counts as a headshot. The reason being, when you shoot a target over range and you hit them at the bottom of the head or you hit them at the top of the spine, it makes it feel like it was a headshot. But if you don't include the neck as a headshot, it counts as a body shot, and that can feel quite cheap. So yeah, head and body shot head and neck counts as a headshot for us. And then slightly different example is, we've still got our physics capsules on the left hand side. The difference here is that, if you're precise and you're up close to somebody, it means that you're physically trying to target a part of their body. So, a precise capsule, a precise hand, a precise leg, and you're going to deal damage to that exact location. However, over 35 meters, or roughly 35 meters, we start to shoot at capsule instead, and this makes it much more tolerant in the sense that you don't have to hit the target in an exact position, you just need to hit them close by. So if you look at this top section here, if you hit roughly that kind of area, it will count as a headshot, even if you hit them here. You haven't actually hit the target. And the reason we've done that is because over range, it feels much more generous to do that. It's much more satisfying to do that. And also the damage is relative. So as I said, if you hit this area of the capsule, it will be the body. If you hit this area of the capsule, it will be the head. You can still hit the hands because you still got this, physics capsules by default. But at a certain range, we turn on this damage capsule, which makes it much more generous for people. One of the challenges in the game is about hitting targets, from a distance, but we don't necessarily want to challenge you too much in terms of collecting ammo, so we want to make it easy for you to top yourself up, even though you can only carry a small amount. So what we did is we started to look at all the different locations in the game where there were through routes for players. There were high traffic areas, and we place ammo in such a way that the player can kind of hoover them up as they run past. So you'll see the radius that's around that ammo box just there. The player just needs to come into contact with that. They don't have to interact with it, they just need to go within the the radius, and they'll automatically collect their own ammo. The same is true when you're low on ammo. If you look around the environment, you'll see the white kind of highlights in the distance. That represents ammo boxes that are they have some contents within them, but also they're going to top up the player, and they only see this when you're low on ammo. So normally they don't highlight themselves, but when you need the ammo, you can see it quite easily in all scenarios. And where this kind of came from as well is, previously we didn't have ammo breakage in the game, which is on the left hand side video. And what would happen is that you would effectively feed, the final section of the game where arrows are coming into, the danger zone, and the person that's being shot at is actually being fed that ammo, so they never have to move from that situation. So take a look at this.
Look at how many arrows there are. Oh god.
On your left. Nice.
Oh wow.
But each of those pickups is arrows on the ground.
Yeah,
So there's no reason to ever move from that situation. So what we introduced was breakage. It might be a little hard to see in this video, but if you watch out for the flash and you listen for the crack of the arrow, you'll see that every time that you shoot an arrow, there is a small chance that the arrow will break. So we're helping to clean up the world as well as prevent it from being abusive. That cracked.
Last one. I'm out.
So it started with 7 arrows. And we've collected 5 because of breakage. Okay, so how do you prevent, an archer from being so dominant? If we're helping you get ammo, if we're helping you hit the target from range, if we're giving you really powerful shots, if we're encouraging you to look down the the sights, well, in this case we have different environmental factors. So we have several different maps in the game. One of which is a mountain kind of map, which is coming out soon. This map has a snowy level. It's limited visibility. You can't really see what's going on. But in this particular scenario, it makes it much harder to see these kind of guards that are over in the distance just here. Shadows is another good one. So we do have night style maps. You can see the pockets of light all around it, but so long as everybody's in crouch, you can pretty much hide in plain view, and it's very difficult to see a target anywhere on these kind of scenarios. Obstacles, so in the center of the screen you'll see a kind of a crane, a wooden pallet that prevents a sight line onto the extraction zone. So at the end of the match, when everybody's panicking to escape, it's normally a sniper's paradise, but we do use these kind of instances to place things in the way so it prevents you from getting easy or abusive kind of shots. Armor is another one. So the playable characters don't get armor, but the AI characters, such as the sheriff and also the knight, they're covered in this black and gold kind of armor, and any range shots just deal no damage to them whatsoever. So basically you either need to avoid them entirely or you need to take them down in a different way. And also blocking. So I said at the start that there's 2 melee characters and 2 ranged characters. The melee characters get block, and from the forward facing kind of angle they can block any incoming damage onto them. It saps a bit of stamina. Blocking costs stamina, but in general blocking is very effective against ranged characters. So just in terms of summary, so we're trying to mitigate the abuse. So this is the thing with being able to shoot round corners. We're trying to prevent that from happening. We're also trying to prevent people from abusing the mechanics in such a way that quick scoping headshots are less effective than trying to do a fully charged shot to somebody that's on the other side of the map. So we're always trying to push you to do not only the player kind of fantasy, but prevent you from getting cheap kills. Aim assists, so again, we're latching you onto a target. We've got homing kind of arrows. We do have a bit of aiming friction in the game as well, and also being able to change directions more slowly, that helps to keep players on target as well. And in general, just love the player. Common frustrations you'll mention is if you're low on ammo, we want to make it easy for you to get the ammo. So that's a really low-hanging fruit that we give to the player. The one about the breakage, the ammo breakage that's on the ground, it's much easier for us to give ammo to players, but when you're feeding your opponent, that feels quite abusive as well. So again, we're trying to reduce common frustrations in general. So that brings us on to our final section. So we chatted about making the bow feel authentic, making it easier for people to use. So now we're going to make it feel very good in general, make it feel satisfying, make it feel like the bow is much more powerful than it actually is. So the way you can go about that is, ideally you want to use the concept of a weapon analog. So what you do is you evoke a comparable feeling using an abstract kind of reference. So for example, the bow and arrow is not a piece of wood, it's a Barrett 50 cal. It needs to feel like this ultra powerful reverberating thing that kind of destroys the environment, as it fires. Missile dispersion, so when you see a rocket flying through the air, you'll see it kind of tearing through the clouds. You'll see the environment almost like refract. The arrows themselves aren't twigs that are flying through the sky. They should feel like it's a missile tearing through the air. And also the sonic boom, so when you fire that arrow, people absolutely need to know about it, and also it needs to show some persistence in the world. The sonic boom represents this large scale magnified effect that everybody can hear and see, and that's where it needs to feel like when Robin fires an arrow, and especially when he fires his ability kind of arrow. So just some nice bits of polish that kind of go along with that, and I'll run through some examples of how we address some of these things. Is during aiming, we just have a simple depth of field kind of effect. It just makes it feel much more polished. It also allows you to keep your focus on the target rather than the character itself. It's a little bit hard to see, but if you look on the left hand side, he's kind of faded out a little bit whilst he's aiming. and the focus is on the center of view. And then a slightly different example is, during your ability, especially if you watch the top right hand corner, you'll see the kind of offset of chromatic aberration, so the world's almost like distorting. Yeah, so you see it becomes offset. And his ability arrow is firing an explosive arrow. They fire it into range, and anybody in that damage sphere gets killed. And you definitely need to know about it. And again, in the top right hand corner, just look at the world kind of refracting. So another one is, you might ask the question from earlier, well, if you fire in your projectile down the center of the screen, then how do you deal with the fact that you have some trails that are going through the environment, and how does it make it feel like it's coming from the weapon? And it's a really simple way how we get around this is we fire the projectile from the center of the screen, but we actually make the trail itself, the VFX that you see in the game, that starts from the weapon itself. So it starts from where the arrow is, it moves to the center of the screen, and then it converges with the projectile itself. So it gives the impression that you're firing the projectile from the weapon, but actually you're firing it from the center of the screen. It's just an optical illusion, but it gives the feeling that the bow is actually firing an arrow, when in reality it's firing from the center of the screen. Hit reactions is another good one. So if you watch each of these, this is me firing an ability arrow at the standard enemy, so it takes him off his feet. So this is about adding power to the bow. Then the ability arrow again to the sentry, so he doesn't fall off his feet, he just stumbles a few steps forward. And then this is the knight, our most powerful enemy, by the ability arrow, so he only stumbles a couple of steps forward. So the point there is that we have a very powerful ability arrow, but the effect of that differs depending on which guards that you shoot against, because some guards are weaker than others. So yeah, it conveys the power, but there's a nice variety that you get depending on who you kill. And then in terms of decapitations, so there is a chance in the game to pop somebody's head. So when again we chat about power in the game, when we chat about meaningful impacts, what we're looking for is the arrow can do something that maybe it couldn't normally do. And we've been looking at The Boys, the reference of The Boys, season 2, and they do something similar to this. So on the left hand side, you get the standard arrow. So every time you fire an arrow, there's a small chance to pop his head. And the way that worked is, in the first example, there was a black and white flash just before it happened, but the first guard, we managed to pop his head. The second guard, we did not. However, if you use an explosive arrow, which is Robin's ability, anybody that's in range will automatically lose their head. So again, the ability arrow makes it feel like it's even more powerful, because there's a much higher chance for this to happen. So if you watch their heads, and you'll see there's a slight delayed reaction between each of them, but yeah, they all lose their heads in that. So again, it makes it feel like the arrow is much more powerful than it actually is in these scenarios. Haptics is another good one, and actually quite an underrated one, especially when it's on gamepad. So the left hand side is the standard haptic that we use in the game. Going from left to right, this is over time, and top to bottom to top is the intensity. So as you're charging the bow, we have a slow, small kind of build. When you get to the point of maximum power, we have a large signifier that tells you, okay, you're ready to fire the maximum power. And also when you kill the target, we also have a small rumble that signifies the kill. For example, you could be shooting a target in the distance, they could be hidden in a bush in the darkness, and you don't necessarily know that you've killed them. So we use haptics to tell you that. And the right hand side is the same thing, but this is for the dual sense. So the way that works is our rumble starts on the left hand side of the controller, it moves to the right hand side of the controller at the bottom, and at the point of where you get to maximum power, the right hand side of the controller just vibrates just as a signifier. And then in terms of audio, so we have different types of shots in the game, as you'll have heard already. You've got quick fire, charge fire when you're at maximum power, and you've got your ability arrow, and they each have different sound effects. So if I go through each of these, you'll hear them increase in power, as well as those hit reactions earlier. The combination of the two makes it feel much more powerful. That's quick fire, charge fire, then the ability arrow. Remember I said about the sonic boom earlier? it's almost like thunder's cracked through the environment. So we get the feeling of it sounds much more powerful. You see the trail, exactly where it's come from, the target. So these things lead into it all feeling much more powerful. Yeah, so as you can see earlier, what I mentioned was the ability arrows explode in heads. You can see its trail from a distance. The feeling of that combined with the audio makes it feel much more powerful than it is. Okay, so the hits, the kill, in different decapitations. Every time you hit a target, you'll get VFX kind of impact, which is effectively a blood spatter. And the blood spatter differs depending on, if it's a hit, whether it's a kill or it's a decapitation. So just an example shown here. Yeah, so the left-hand side is a small, spurt. The kill is slightly bigger, and then the decapitation is the blood is constantly spurting out the head for some time, after they've died. Again, it makes it feel much more prominent that you've done something, much more deadly in that case. So just a quick summary on that one. So know your analog is the key, really. You just need to find a comparative with your particular weapon, with your particular feature that signifies the kind of the desired feel, and then build that into the mechanics, build it into the feedback that you give to the player, and also celebrate in satisfaction. So players should always want to get the really cool headshot, and the best type of headshot is when you're chasing a target over distance. You shoot them in the head, but their head explodes and they get the hit reaction where their body kind of flips onto the ground. So there's layers of not only immediate satisfaction, but there's some randomization in the fact that sometimes you may not always get the best one that you want, but when you do, it feels extra special. And then refine and polish. So, there's nothing too small or insignificant to improve upon. This relates to, maybe the camera work, also the haptics as well, the differences in each of the types of audio that we have. You just want to, critique every single aspect of your particular mechanics, your particular weapon, and just build upon it in such a way so that, people may not necessarily notice it when it's there, but they'll definitely know when it's missing. And, just as a reminder, these are the three things you should take into account, especially as we did on Hood, where, the authenticity is all about, your inspirations, how it feeds into the bow and its behaviors and the mechanics. The accessibility is, how do you make it as broad appealing as possible? And then the aesthetics is all about making it feel satisfying. So, that last step is the thing that it makes the difference between a good bow and a great bow, basically, if you do that stuff. And that's about it. That's a whistle-stop tour of the bow and arrow in Hood. I'm sure you might have some more questions about, how that behaves and how it works. And I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks very much.
So, Jimmy, thank you for such a comprehensive speech. So, of course, we have questions in our Q&A section. The first question is from Vladimir. He asks, considering the bow mechanics and DualSense support, how DualSense features can enhance the player experience? And maybe how to utilize DualSense features from inside game engine.
Yeah, that's cool. So for the first part, in terms of the haptics themselves, the main benefit of the DualSense is it can give you feedback that means that the player doesn't necessarily have to look somewhere on the screen. So, for example, when you get to maximum power on Hood, we have a UI indicator that tells you when you're at maximum power, but also the haptics on the pad tell you that. So you don't necessarily need to look at the visuals on the screen. So that's a nice subtle way how we can reinforce that. In terms of the engine itself, we used Unreal 4. And we used that in combination with Wise. So effectively, we made some Rumble assets. We imported them into Wise, and Wise has some events that link to Unreal. So that's how we kind of set it up behind the scenes. But that might differ for different engines.
Thank you for answering. He says, wonderful design. So I think he's satisfied with your answer. So guys, we have time left for other questions, so we're waiting for them. And now let's talk about the team. So bow design is about many aspects like VFX, SFX, And tell me, please, do you have a special like weapon game designer who works on it, or it's multiple designers, like level designer, for instance, who is responsible for it also?
Yeah, in terms of our team, we had a small gameplay team, so everything related to the bow was done by myself on the design side, but we also worked with animators, UI, code, things like that. From a level design perspective, the level designers would place grapple points around the map, but also the level designers were responsible for creating the sight lines. So when I said earlier, there are some maps where we put blockers in the way to prevent you getting cheap kills, it would be the level designers that would place those blockers. Similarly, they would also be the ones that would create the long sight lines if we wanted a map to give you some real kind of hero kills, like on Twitch. But yeah, in terms of the core mechanics themselves, that was on the gameplay side. But how that played out in the levels was we had a small team of level designers, 3 level designers across 6 maps.
Whoa, so you are saying that you have a small team, but the design is really comprehensive. You work on so many details. So my question is, do you reuse the assets? For instance, if you create, I don't know, an animation for a bow shot, can you use it later with other weapons?
Yeah, it's a good question. Particularly for Hood, the ranger that we've just saw in that presentation, he actually has the same animation for when he shoots an arrow as also when he shoots his ability. Our intention was to have a different animation for when he fires his ability arrow to make it feel more special. However, we do have a second character called Marion, and she has a wrist-mounted crossbow, and actually she has a completely different set of animations. The reason being, it's more akin to the difference between a sniper rifle and a machine gun in a shooting game. That's kind of the difference between the two characters. We do share a lot of animations between the characters, for instance, movement, climbing, sprint, things like that. But nothing to do with the weapons. The weapons are unique for all 4 characters.
Well, well done. And can you tell me how many playtest sessions do you need to improve the mechanics of bow or any other weapon?
Yeah, that's interesting. So playtest wise, we did playtests almost every single day on this project. Not just with the bow, but in general. But on the bow itself, my dev Steam account has 175 hours logged with just rubbing alone. And then that's just Steam. Then on top of that, within the engine, there's probably at least another 200 hours just for that character kind of alone. So easily, 300 hours plus, especially if you're trying to chase down, some of the better examples in the industry. I mentioned The Last of Us and Tomb Raider and things like that. To be comparable to those, every single day you could improve the bow.
Whoa. 300 hours just for bow, or for all of the weapons?
Just for the bow, and then we have 3 other weapons on top of that. Yeah.
Wow, so that takes really lots of effort. And you said that The Last of Us and Tomb Raider were your main references. And what did you take of them?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the 3 main references when I say Tomb Raider, Tomb Raider is a good example in that there'd been 3 iterations of Tomb Raider, and the main takeaways with that were what were the differences between Tomb Raider 1 and Tomb Raider 2, and what was the difference between Tomb Raider 2 and Tomb Raider 3, and mostly it was to do with the power of the weapon. In Tomb Raider 1, the weapon feels like it's a twig. It feels like it's made of wood. By the time you get to the 3rd Tomb Raider, I think it's Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the weapon feels like you're firing a grenade launcher. It feels extra powerful in terms of the environmental kind of side. Audio is a big one as well. So, the sound of the weapon, especially in The Last of Us 2, I think they use violin strings and they use, metal on metal to make it feel like the bow is more powerful than it actually is. So yeah, I would say those are the main two, to not make it feel like it's just a piece of string and some wood, audio and visuals stuff.
Well, that's amazing work. And we have a little bit more time left and questions from our audience. So Arthur asks, what there are some differences in implementation of targeting and movement with heavy bow and with lighter one?
Does that mean for trying to hit a certain character, or?
I think for a certain character, yes.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of hitting different characters, the scale of the characters themselves, it might not be that obvious, but all of the characters in our game are exactly the same height, and they're exactly the same size. In terms of a target, they're all the same. In terms of hitting them with a quick fire or a charge fire, the only real difference is that how long it takes the projectile to hit the target. And when you're hitting a target that's really far away, we're just more generous in general. But when they're really close to you, you are physically trying to hit their body, maybe plus 5% in terms of the size. But yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question. It's more about we try and make it as generous as possible where we can.
Thank you. We have another question, the last question. We have time for a question from Vladimir. He asks, he says, you talked about switching the hitbox collision from physics body to capsule according to distance to target. Does it also apply to player VC player scenario?
Yes, it does. Yeah, that applies to all characters in the game, except for the sheriff, maybe. So the sheriff's our large kind of evil monster kind of mini boss character, but yeah, in general it was mostly a PvP change, but it actually applies to all characters, both AI and player.